Now that they've kicked the tires around the league of incumbent head coaches, the Knicks are expanding their coaching search to those that are looking for jobs and not currently employed. That includes Taylor Jenkins and Mike Brown, and we're going to be talking about that and much more on today's episode.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
All right, welcome in to Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast. I'm Alex Wolfe. I'm editor-in-chief of Knicks site, The Strickland, which you can find at thestrict.land. And he's Gavin Schall, your favorite play-by-play broadcaster's favorite play-by-play broadcaster, and the Saturday co-host of the Locked On NBA podcast. And today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. On today's show, we got a bunch to talk about, as has been usual lately. Lots of news flying around about the Knicks head coaching search. Now in the way of Mike Brown and Taylor Jenkins news. The recently fired head coaches of Sacramento and Memphis will be interviewing with the Knicks this coming week, according to reports. We're going to give a little breakdown of the cases for both of those guys, plus talk a little bit about the Desmond Bane trade to close the show and what it kind of means for the East, and overall what it means if that's where the market is going in this coming offseason. So obviously another big trade still to come in the form of Kevin Durant as well. Whenever that happens, maybe that also helps set whatever market there's going to be this postseason. But we're going to talk about that and what implications maybe it could have on the Knicks and the rest of the East. But first, we want to thank you all for making Locked On Knicks your first listen today and every day, whether you're checking us out on your favorite podcast platform or taking in the sights and sounds on YouTube. We appreciate you making us part of your daily routine. So, Gavin, we've got news on the Knicks coaching front search. Surprise, surprise. They asked around the league, and once they confirmed that coaches that they liked that were currently employed were not going anywhere, they now are looking at other coaches. I know this is mind-blowing for people who were ready to throw it all in last week and say, oh my God, they can't hire someone who's already hired. These idiots didn't have a plan. But as it turns out, the Knicks did have a plan. James Edwards is reporting for The Athletic that they have their first two interviews lined up. CP, the franchise of Knicks Fan TV, backs this up, that Mike Brown, formerly of Sacramento, and Taylor Jenkins, formerly of the Memphis Grizzlies, will both be interviewing this week for the Knicks. CP has a key point here that he brings up, which is that the Knicks want more synergy, between the next head coach, staff, and front office. I think that would be a very good thing to have. Seems like a valuable thing to have synergy up and down in the organization, especially as it pertains to how it might affect roster building, how they use that one second round pick that they're going to have in this draft. What they potentially do in free agency or the trade market. It's going to be good to have an organization that is fully aligned on what it is they want to do this offseason. But Gavin, I'll throw it to you first in terms of who you want to talk about first between Mike Brown and Taylor Jenkins. But my overall impression is, if you're going to pick your first two guys to interview, these two seem like pretty good established candidates that have both had pretty solid careers so far.
Yeah, I wanted to say real quick on the organizational alignment point, because I think it is so essential, and it's something that we maybe didn't even drive home enough with Tom Thibodeau, that it felt like the front office did consistently give him like great ingredients, and that's showing as guys have gone on to other places, and especially like looking at what Obi Toppin's doing in Indiana and this year with Cat, and Tibbs was almost like, if anyone who enjoys the Food Network show Chopped, where you get 4 secret ingredients and have to make a dish, Tibbs, like no matter what the ingredients were, like lobster, bitter melon, like he was baking a cake every single time. It might be a slightly different flavored cake, but the guy was always going to make a cake no matter what the ingredients were. And hopefully these coaches can make the dish that the roster requires. And also, I think what's most important is just like not that these coaches are forcing that, but the Knicks are planning on hiring someone that just like conceptually and philosophically are just on the same page with the front office. So there's no gap to transcend. And I do think both Mike Brown and Taylor Jenkins are representative of that. So I wanted to give like a broad overview of both before we do a deep dive on maybe Brown and then Jenkins. Mike Brown, career record 434, 435, excuse me, and 304. I didn't know this. He started coaching the NBA in the late 90s at age 27, which is just extraordinary to be an assistant coach that young. And I don't know if he had a playing career. I didn't look that up, but that's just amazing. Of course, everyone knows him for being Cleveland coach during LeBron's first tenure from 2006 to 2010. He took the Cavs to the 2007 finals and the 2009 Eastern Conference Finals. A lot of people, I would assume, felt those teams underachieved because of having LeBron at his athletic apex. I will say those rosters on the margins were very subpar around LeBron generally. He was a Warriors assistant coach from 2016 to 2022, where they won 3 championships. When Steve Kerr was out with chronic back pain, he led them to a 12-0 record during that 16-17 run. I don't know how much that should go to his credit, given that was the greatest roster or nearly the greatest roster of all time, but still cool. Best accomplishment, most recent accomplishment, of course, taking the Kings to 48 wins in his first season as head coach, winning NBA Coach of the Year unanimously for the first time in league history. I know our guy, Matt George of Locked On Kings, who I'm going to have on the podcast tomorrow to talk about Mike Brown, was irate that he was fired and thought it was ridiculous that he was fired. We will get into the pros and cons on Mike Brown, but real quick on Taylor Jenkins, 250 and 214 and 214 all-time Grizzlies coach, 2019 to 2025. I was really impressed with the Grizzlies, Alex, just consistently over the last 6 years. They had a million injuries, including consistently to your favorite player in the NBA, Brandon Clark. That record includes the 27 and 55 year in 23-24, where just everyone was hurt. It was kind of out of Taylor Jenkins' control. They got to the second round in 21-22 before losing to the Warriors in 6. Made the playoffs 2 other times. I thought, given how young that team was, and all the injuries that they dealt with, I think Taylor Jenkins pretty consistently overachieved in Memphis. Again, both coaches have specific strengths, but I think both of them have pretty consistently elevated the talent they had at their disposal.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with Brown. I think that the thing that stands out to me with Mike Brown compared to, say, a Tibbs, like, I think that it would be easy to look at Brown and be like, well, how is he that much different than Tibbs, right? Like, he's a guy who's been coaching for a really long time, a retread of sorts, someone that you're trusting to come into your team and give you something different. But he's been coaching since the mid 2000s. Like, how do you know for sure that things are going to be different this time? And I think that you can look at the way that he ran Sacramento and say, like, this is a guy that clearly has evolved a little more with the game than a Tibbs. I think that they push the pace really well there, which I think would be an important tenet for the Knicks, and probably is something that led them to potentially want to go with him as the coach, like leveraging having a De'Aaron Fox, leveraging having a really good passing big in Domantas Sabonis. Like, I always felt like, and I mean, we'd have to do a little more, get a little more granular with it in looking at how he exactly approach things and whatever. But I think that just looking at it from the outside, and in the occasional times the Knicks would face them, it did seem like, they ran a fast offense. They ran an offense that maximized their players and that made sense for the personnel that they had, generated a lot of looks for shooters like Malik Monk. It was, I think, a really solidly coached roster. And again, to your point, seemed to get the most out of it. I mean, that was one of those. And I mean, look, you could say the same about Tibbs to a degree when he first started with the Knicks, right? Like, he came in, he really squeezed everything that he could get out of that 20-21 roster and got them to the playoffs and got everything he could out of Julius Randle and whatever, and helped effectively raise the floor. But with Brown, I mean, kind of similar vibes there in terms of being a culture setter, but also I think that he does just in general understand the modern game a little better than Tibbs does, particularly on the offensive end. And throughout his career, he's been a part of some really good defensive squads as well, dating all the way back to the Cavs, where I feel pretty confident in saying, even with, especially with, I shouldn't say even with, especially with the personnel that he had with the Kings. I know that they weren't exactly world beaters on defense, but they really had, I mean, any lineup where you're going to have Sabonis as your 5-man in the middle, you're kind of behind the 8 ball there to begin with on defense. And I think that he tended to do about as well as you could reasonably expect, given a very offensively inclined roster that he was given in Sacramento. So just again, early thoughts on him before really diving in and looking at the numbers more and stuff like that, I feel pretty good about Brown being on the list. And of all the guys that, are the recently fired candidates, I feel pretty solid about him being one of them that the Knicks are thinking of bringing in.
Yeah, I was very impressed with what he did in Sacramento on the offensive end. The single biggest thing to me was building around two stars that were both like below average shooters for their position. Like Sabonis just this year started hitting threes at a high rate, but still was only taking about two per game. And De'Aaron Fox, I know, I think it was 22, 23. I think it was that 48 win year where he had kind of an outlier 3-point shooting season, if I'm remembering correctly, but obviously generally is not particularly known for his shooting. They had good shooting around those guys with like Kevin Herter, Keon Ellis, like various pieces over the years. And yet they were still able to, like, I mean, they set offensive records right in that first season in 2020, in 22, 23. And I think in some ways, like, set a pretty decent template for what Rick Carlisle is doing in Indiana. Ironically, they handed them Tyrese Halliburton to run that system. I also read up on our buddy Shax's article. Like, he did a deep dive on Coach Brown's system on his Substack. I would encourage everyone to check that out in depth because he is just, I mean, right there with our guy Benji Ritholtz for just the best film breakdown Knicks analyst. But he emphasized the fact that they run a lot of elbow-oriented sets, which I think if the Knicks still had Julius Randle would work really well. I'm curious how it would work with Cat, and he gets into this in the article, but obviously Cat is not quite the passer that Sabonis is. But unlike with Sabonis, you can push Cat out to the 3-point line when like operating those dribble handoffs or him trying to hit guys backdoor, because he does have legitimate gravity out there and like well beyond the arc, unlike Domantas Sabonis. So you wanted to have Sabonis a little bit closer and get Fox closer to the rim going downhill. Big emphasis on handoffs, on off-ball movement. We've seen Jalen Brunson thrive off DHOs, and they can be a substitute for pick and rolls. It might even be a little bit cleaner, given that Cat is not naturally a great screen setter. The off-ball stuff, if the Knicks keep all three wings, obviously Mikal Bridges, Josh Hart, and OG Anunoby are all excellent at that. Like Bridges and Hart in particular are great cutters. Obviously Hart and Anunoby to different extents, and Bridges too last season were really high level finishers. So that's exciting to me. Really high play calling rate. There is a pretty consistent trend across the NBA that higher play calling rates generally lead to better offense, to the best of my knowledge. And Brown is very good at that and very good at tailoring it specifically to his player skill sets, which I think was an area Tom Thibodeau struggled. And he certainly was not very diverse in how he approached his play calling. Like it was obviously pretty much all centered around the two stars, except for later in the year where he started incorporating Mikal Bridges and OG Anunoby a little bit more. I think we'd get more consistency in that respect from Mike Brown. Again, would highly encourage everyone to check out the full article from Shax at Shax NBA. Hopefully, Alex, when one of these guys is hired or someone else is hired, we'll get him on the pod to do a deeper dive, because I feel like I'm not doing it justice, but he did a great breakdown on that. He also did a really good breakdown on Taylor Jenkins, so we'll tell you a little bit more about what Taylor Jenkins would bring to the table, what his offense is like. We'll get into that in just a sec here on Locked On Knicks.
But first, we want to let you know about our friends over at Monarch Money. And do you ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. And Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. And I'll tell you what my favorite thing is, it's the all-in-one convenience, because instead of juggling multiple apps, you can just use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. It's tough to keep on top of that stuff yourself, especially if you got multiple credit cards you use for different things, if you got multiple accounts, different streaming services, everything. Finances, it's not so easy as just writing out a couple checks every month anymore. There's a lot going on from a lot of different places, essentially microtransactions throughout your whole life. Having all that in one app like Monarch Money, super, super helpful in my day-to-day. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. All righty, we're back into talk through the Taylor Jenkins of it all. So you mentioned some of this already, Gavin, but I'll just briefly rehash. 250 and 214 record over the course of the better part of 6 seasons with the Grizzlies, 2019 to 2025. They had a couple rebuild years in there, so the fact that they still had as good of a record as they did, pretty big plus for him, I think, to still be that many games above 500, despite the fact that they had a couple of years that they just frankly were not looking to win, and in fact were probably trying to better their draft position. I would say the biggest thing to me that plays into the Jenkins interview is he played a very long rotation, particularly this year. If you looked at the Grizzlies roster, even like John Morant himself was only averaging like, I think like 28 minutes a game or something like that. And that was the best player on their team. Pretty much everyone was at about 28 minutes or less. I don't know for sure if you want to do that with the Knicks or not. You might still want guys to play more like 34 minutes a game or something like that, particularly like Brunson, Cat, whoever. Hopefully Jenkins would be able to make that, you know, delineation there and decide who plays more, who plays less. But I think the big thing is if your biggest sticking point with Tibbs was the fact that he was playing what by many measures was one of the worst 5-man lineups in the league in big minutes, the most minutes in the league by far, and continually going to it no matter what the data said, I think you could pretty safely say that Taylor Jenkins is probably going to be high on your list as far as potential coaching candidates, because one thing that he's really shown, especially lately in his coaching career with Memphis, was that he was more than willing to play a really long rotation and do a lot of experimenting. And I think that we even saw that in some of the games against the Knicks this year.
Yeah, I will say real quick, just because there's connective tissue there. I forgot to get into the cons for Mike Brown, and that is probably the biggest one I could find beyond just his age, is that like he did not really lean into Keon Ellis, and it was a story I was kind of following from afar with our buddy Matt over at Locked On Kings, just because it had so many echoes of the Deuce situation with Tom Thibodeau, because Keon's a guy who is just an excellent defender, like really high level 3-point shooter, like similar to Deuce, except he's bigger. So you don't even have like he's too small. Like some guys are going to just post him up, boomer excuse that Tibbs had nominally had in his mind for Deuce McBride. And for whatever reason, Mike Brown did not want to lean into starting Keon Ellis, even though he made such obvious sense in their starting lineup compared to someone like Malik Monk. And like, given just all the like shot first guys in the Kings and some of those contracts, I'm sure that played into it, but it just reminded me of the Deuce situation in a bad way. So that would be something to watch with Mike Brown. And to your point, I think with Taylor Jenkins, we would literally never have to worry about that because he plays everyone. I just double checked. Ja was at 30 minutes, which like when you said that number, I was like, there's no way that could be right. And it was like essentially right. Like that is crazy, crazy low for like the face of your franchise to be playing 30 minutes when you contrast it with the Knicks, right? Who had 3 guys at 38 or above. That is appealing to head at least a little bit more in that direction. And the reason they were able to do that, and a reason that, like, by my count, they had 13 different guys playing rotation minutes for them over the course of the season, is because 1, Memphis built out a great bench, but 2, Taylor Jenkins was just willing to trust those guys and to empower those guys and to like lean very specifically into their strengths and say, hey, if you're good at this, like, I'm not going to take that away from you. And my job as a coach is to highlight what you do well and like cover up your weaknesses. And if you can be additive because your strengths are so strong, like, I don't really care if you have a glaring weakness. And I think that is in pretty stark contrast to Tom Thibodeau. On top of that, like through, to the best of my knowledge, through like all 5 years, like he leaned really, really heavily into 5 out and had very modern spacing principles. And at least in this last season, it's something we can get into in the cons a little bit, Alex. It was somewhat difficult to divorce, like, all right, what was his offense and what was his assistant's offense? They brought in Noah LaRoche and Tomas Lisalo, if I'm remembering his name correctly. He's now the Grizzlies head coach. GM Zach Kleiman just kind of forced those hires on Taylor Jenkins. And there was a lot of talk in Memphis about how it was this weird hybrid system and no one was very comfortable with it. And they basically stopped running pick and rolls altogether. So that is certainly something for the Knicks front office to parse through, but purely as like in terms of his philosophy and as a culture builder, and also someone like you would consistently see him like running onto the court and like yelling at opposing players or yelling at the refs, like the fire that he brought into the table and his willingness to stand up for these guys. I do think he brings a lot of the same intangible qualities that did make Tom Thibodeau great in some ways and did make Tom Thibodeau successful, while also having a far more modern approach to basketball that I think, to our initial point in this episode, aligns him with the front office far better than Tibbs was. And I think just aligns with this roster far better than Tibbs was. And I think we would see Deuce McBride in the starting lineup to begin the year, which of course is a personal agenda for me, but also I think is just simply what the data backs up is the Knicks' best lineup.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, in relation to the awkward situation that Jenkins was in this year, is that most of the things that I'm seeing from people that cover the Grizzlies and, were kind of privy to that whole situation seem to say he was sort of just in a position where it seemed like he was going to be fired all year this year, and they were just looking for the right excuse. And that the front office had kind of like already made up their mind about wanting to get rid of him, and therefore, removed his whole staff essentially and said, we're installing our own staff, put those 2 lead assistants in there, like you mentioned, one of which becomes the head coach and gets full-timed, like with very little thought behind it after the season is up, after they fire Jenkins so late in the season. It seemed like a lot of the players were not exactly over the moon about him getting fired, and kind of were still ready to go to bat for him. I would say that I'd be more willing to put stock into the offensive numbers that came before him, getting those handpicked assistants just kind of foisted on him, and give him kind of the benefit of the doubt in terms of like whatever happened in the years prior to that in regards to how many pick and rolls they ran and what their offense looked like. I would say that's probably more likely to be what his offense would look like if he coaches the Knicks and is able to build out his staff again. Maybe we'll see a situation again where Leon Rose kind of does a similar thing to what he did with Tibbs and says, hey, like, I do have a couple other guys in mind that I want to bring in as like kind of lead assistants with you. Hopefully that's okay, but we'll let you build out the end of your bench for sure. Like we just want to get a couple other really smart minds in here that we like and respect, and make sure that everyone has everything that they need going into the season. Wouldn't totally surprise me if that happens, but I also, I think that there's a decent chance that whatever he did prior to those new assistants being installed this year is more what we'll see going forward from him, whether it's with the Knicks or whether he ultimately has to wait, I don't know, a year or whatever until he gets hired next year, when there's more head coaching openings than just the Knicks job. But we'll see, what ultimately ends up happening with him. And first he has to get the Knicks job, obviously, before that starts becoming a thing. But while we're talking about the Memphis Grizzlies, a big trade went down today. So Desmond Bane goes to the Orlando Magic in a trade package that was a little reminiscent of a certain Knicks trade package last year. Certainly drew some instant comparisons to the Mikal Bridges trade. So we're going to talk about that, the big NBA news of today, talk about what it means for the East. And I might actually throw a little something out there as far as if the Grizzlies are kind of in tear it down mode, there's at least one guy on that team that I'm fairly interested in. I don't know if it's
Scottie Pippen Jr. Let's
that,
go. We're on the
thanks
ride.
for spoiling it, Gavin. Now they won't even have to. No, I'm just kidding. It's someone else. We'll see. In just a sec, we get back into Locked On Knicks.
But first, I want to tell you about our good friends over at FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. I am all in on the Oklahoma City Thunder in Game 5. They have been utterly dominant at home in these playoffs. The Indiana Pacers, aside from like a little bit of the third quarter and the fourth quarter in Game 1, have not been particularly competitive with the Thunder on their home floor. I know Indiana is extraordinarily resilient. I know we joke about them having some sort of devil magic on their side. I don't really care about all that. I would take Oklahoma City big. The line is not really all that significant. I would bet on Oklahoma City to win game 5 in a significant way. And you can also go into like a little individual bet. Like if you think you have a read on a player heating up, why not back it up with the same game parlay? Man, I love the way Jalen Williams has been playing in this series. Like, I think especially if he gets off to a slow start in game 5, I would go all in on whatever his adjusted over is throughout the game. And the cool thing about FanDuel is you can do that live. If you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make everyone more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, we're going to talk Desmond Bane trade in just a sec. I wanted to just real quick just to put a bow on Taylor Jenkins. Hopefully we'll have either DeMichael Cole or Joe Mullinax on to dive a little deeper into all of this. But just in terms of the cons, the pick and roll version is interesting. He did run more prior to the assistant coaches coming in. So I tend to agree with you. That's not something to totally fear, but obviously that's kind of Jalen Brunson's bread and butter. And particularly if you're playing 5 out, I think it could be Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns' bread and butter. Does not really have the same organized the same rate of organized offense that Mike Brown does, according to Shaq's. So that's going to be something that's interesting to watch. That being said, we have watched for a few years now, like when the system is just, hey, Jalen, go cook them. Like that worked pretty well despite cramped spacing. I think Jalen, go cook them with ideal spacing could very easily be a top 3 offense. You might not need to complicate it any more than that, similar to what Dallas has done with Luka Doncic for years, just put shooters around him and watch him go to work. The other thing is that he's never been out of the second round. I personally am not really concerned about it. I talked about it a little bit with Matt Moore, who's obviously Locked On Nuggets host, but also a national reporter on Locked On NBA last night. And he seemed to think that, like, I think his biggest concern was that he wasn't 100% sure if Taylor had the personality, at least as like a relatively young coach, to handle like the expectations that are in New York and some of the locker room issues that we've talked about and we know are there for the Knicks, where he thought Mike Brown would be pretty good at that. So I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with that, just because everything I've seen from Taylor Jenkins from a personality perspective, I've really liked, but just something I want to note, something we'll talk a little bit more with the Locked On Grizzlies guys. But Alex, we'll finish up on this. Desmond Bane heads over to Eastern Conference after all the influx of talent to the West, including Cooper Flagg headed that way. The Knicks have caught so many breaks in terms of great players going the wrong way. One heads over to East. I heard a lot of people, I think this was an overpay. Certainly all of my friend NBA group chats were saying, oh man, 4 first-round picks. That's crazy. That's crazy. I totally disagree. We are fresh off Pascal Siakam. Like, I think everyone forgets he's traded for 3 first-round picks. I don't think anyone in Indiana cares about that. And that's because even if he's not an every year all-star, he's a great player who is just exactly what they needed. And I see this being a very similar type of move for the Orlando Magic, who were just the worst jump shooting team for like a team that made the playoffs in modern NBA history, darn close to it. There's a stat that they shot 35% on open catch and shoot jumpers this year. Bane is 50% on those. He's one of the 10 best shooters on planet Earth. He's a great defender. I think he's highly underrated as a driver, like has a great pickup package in transition, is a pretty creative finisher. He's someone, in retrospect, if the Knicks were going to trade a million picks, I would have rather they had gone his way than Mikal Bridges. Like, I know people are making that comparison. I think he's flat out a better player, mostly because of the shooting and just how valuable that is. But I think it's exactly what Orlando needed. And as a top 4, they have a top 4 that is comparable to anyone's in the Eastern Conference, including the New York Knicks. And I think right now they're right in that conversation that Indiana has to be at the top of. But like, if the second tier is the Knicks, the Cavs, what's left of the Celtics, maybe I don't know who else you'd want to put in there. I think Orlando certainly belongs in that mix. And there's a case they could be better than the Knicks next year. I think I'd keep the Knicks on top just because of Jalen Brunson versus Paolo Banchero, but it's a conversation now, and Orlando got a lot scarier.
Yeah, I'm not as big on the deal, if I'm being completely honest.
Talking through it.
Yeah, so the deal as a whole, Desmond Bane for Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Cole Anthony, 4 unprotected first-round picks, 1 first-round pick swap. One of those unprotected picks is the number 16 pick in this draft. I'm not going to front like I know enough about this draft to say, hey, that number 16 pick is going to turn into someone immediately. That said, I do think the Magic have a good enough draft record that I would be like, there's a decent chance that is going to turn into a decent NBA role player. I don't know. To me, I look at Bane and I say, yeah, I do think he's a good defender for his size, but I do think that there's a pretty I think there's kind of a limit to how much positional flexibility he has on defense because of the fact that he's like 6'3", 6'4" with
I think he's 6'5", but I can look it up.
either way, he's got a negative wingspan, which is
Yeah.
not great. Which was well reported going into the draft. Like his wingspan is, I think, an inch lower than what his height is, which does not
6'5".
exactly
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
right. So it does not allow you to go up positions super easily. Granted, we've seen guys like Dylan Brooks, who has a similar build, be a fairly cagey defender, albeit he's a little bit taller, if I'm not mistaken. But either way, from that perspective, I look at that and I go, maybe you're just banking then on, okay, but you also have, you have Jalen Suggs, who is a plus wingspan guy, is a scalable defender. You have both Wagner and Banchero, who are bigger dudes, scalable defenders, super athletic. Maybe you just don't worry about that too much. You scheme to keep Bane on guys through like the 1 to 3 positions and just live with that. The creation and the shooting, I think, will be really good for them. That said, I think what it seems like a lot of people seem to agree the number one thing that they needed is a more pure point guard than a Jalen Suggs, someone that can organize their offense a little better and lest they kind of fall into the risk of being like sort of what the Toronto Raptors have been building for the last few years, which is like guys that have scoring talent and whatever, but nobody really to organize all of it, and banking on just like wings on wings on wings in theory could work, I guess, but unless you like really hit the jackpot, like a team like Boston, for example, where they run a lot of offense through Tatum and Brown, who are, wings without a doubt, but like 100th percentile level talents, that really make it work and build an offense that works around them, where they can kick it out to guys like Derek White or Drew Holiday. But Derek White or Drew Holiday on other teams have run those teams. It's like, so they ultimately are just kind of saying, hey, we don't need you guys to run this all the time, but sometimes we might need you to bring the ball up the floor and you might have to run the offense. I don't know if the Magic have that now. So from that perspective, I'm not like super in on it. If this is essentially what you just burned like the trade package on, granted, again, it's the Orlando Magic. I don't want to sound like a big market snob, but I think that the only way that they're getting better players in, not through the draft, is by trading for them. And with the level of player input that players are allowed to put in this modern NBA in terms of where their destinations are, I really doubt that there are too many players that are like, send me to the Magic. Like, that's where I want to go. Just because it's not a huge market. It's not, I guess there's the income tax thing, which is helpful, and has drawn some players to the Florida life before. But other than that, like, it's just not a place that has experienced the level of success, even where it has that, like, or just the level of lifestyle that someplace like Miami or something offers, where it seems like every player is always at least a little bit interested in going and playing for the Heat, because they offer the Miami lifestyle, no income tax, all that good stuff. There isn't really as much of that with Orlando. So maybe this is just like the best move that they could make happen to try to make their team better. That said, I don't know that I would call it like a huge overpay, but I would say it better work out, and things better not work out how they did this past year, which I know part of which was due to injuries and stuff. But like, even once the Magic kind of got everything back together towards the end of the season, they didn't look nearly as good as they did for the first few weeks of the season, throughout the whole end part of the season. So if this move does not ultimately push them to some other stratosphere or put them in like the top 4 in the East or whatever next year, it's going to be pretty risky business there. So we'll see how it works out.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. I do think a lot of it depends on if they get early season Banchero and playoff Banchero versus late season Banchero, because those were two completely different guys. I want to just note before we end the episode, I think the name you were going to mention earlier was John Conchart. No, it was Jaren Jackson Jr. And we are out of time, but we will dive deep on him in a future episode. I think it's really interesting, and I think he could potentially be a great piece for the Knicks. How they would actually get him, that's a lot more complicated, but we'll talk about it on a future episode of Locked On Knicks. Plenty of fun stuff to come this week. Draft coverage, interview with some of those hosts that we mentioned to learn more about these coaches, and maybe a breaking news episode on a new head coach. You'll have to subscribe, but until then, we'll talk to you soon on Locked On Knicks.